Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 8th of June, where we are talking about Frankenstein. And I also wanted to talk about the first journal assignment. It was a little bit over optimistic when I was indicating that the first journal would be due today on Tuesday the 8th. Though certainly you can hand it in today if you wanted to. But I think that Thursday the 10th makes more sense because by that point we would have put closure on the novel itself. So you've got up until Thursday the 10th to submit in your first journal up until midnight. Please send that to me via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And I will evaluate that informally as if we were having a conversation on paper. I'm not going to evaluate it for grammar or mechanics. And then I put a check mark grade on it with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory. That's where most of the grades fall. There also is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And I was thinking about a page or so of thoughts and reflections, in this instance about Frankenstein, though certainly you can reference other texts that we have addressed or will be addressing over the course of this semester. But I just wanted you to have some written commentary over the course of the semester for all of the major pieces of literature that we will be reading. And those journals might be of assistance for you for your first paper, which I have included some paper topics in the syllabus and other documents folder above on our Moodle site, and I will talk specifically about those topics next class as I transition over from talking about Frankenstein into our next major text, which happens to be Persuasion. So my hope is that by Thursday you can have, ideally, the entirety of Persuasion read, but at least some of Persuasion read as we talk about it over a few classes. And by that point, that means that you should be anticipating the next text in our reading. For Frankenstein, what I did was I started us off with a film, very iconic film, the 1931 James Whale version of Frankenstein that's made Frankenstein part of popular culture. And in addition to my wanting to talk a little bit about that film and popular culture, I was also hopeful that that might have given you a little bit more time to complete the reading. And Frankenstein has never been out of print, so there is something about this particular text that's captured audience imaginations. But the reality is that probably most people know Frankenstein not through the text itself, but through film, and probably it's the 1931 James Whale film. And there's a very high likelihood that most individuals haven't seen the film itself. They've just heard of the film and all of the popular culture references to the particular film. So I had indicated, I believe, that I teach a class in popular culture. So I'm very interested in the idea of film and other venues of popular culture and ways of giving us a lens into the fears and anxieties and also the beliefs, values, and behaviors of society at the time. And I mention fears and anxieties because one of the media classes I teach is in horror film. And while we don't necessarily review Frankenstein specifically for the 1930s, we review Dracula. Both Dracula and Frankenstein are iconic films from this particular time period. And as one of you noted in the attendance question response that I had you fill out about your reactions to the film, one of you noted that it's attributed to a text by Mrs. Percy Shelley. And I very much wanted to draw your attention to that because I think it says a great deal about the sexism that existed, not just during the time in which the novel was written, but the time in which the film was produced in the 1930s. You remember we began the semester by reviewing how female was viewed in the 1800s, and we went all the way to the 1950s, actually. And in terms of Mrs. Percy Shelley, it does remind me a little bit of Mrs. Mallard in Story of an Hour about the female identity being that of her husband. Now, Mary Shelley's husband was quite famous, Percy Shelley, the great romantic poet. But I think that says everything about the time period when we get the film presented to us in that way. And I had indicated in watching the film that you shouldn't really think of it as an adaptation of the novel. You should probably think of it more as a completely separate story. because not only are there a good number of omissions, but there are also dramatic changes in terms of the plot. So I think that this also gives us a sense of some of the values and belief systems of an early Hollywood during the time period. For instance, the happy ending. And in fact, it was actually code at the time that the monster or the monstrosity in a film needed to be defeated. The evil needed to be defeated. And we know that the text in Frankenstein is a much more complicated text than what we are getting in Hollywood films. So that said, if you know anything about the word monster in Latin, it means to reveal or to show. And I think that oftentimes what we view as the other, or that which is different, or that which is monstrosity, is a way to reveal or show us about ourselves and our society. Because ultimately, Frankenstein, the text, is a morality tale. But perhaps even the film, on some levels, is a morality tale. The biggest difference that most of you notice in your attendance responses is that we don't have the embedded narrative. We don't have the character of Walton. It was very important in terms of the text because the novel Frankenstein is an epistolary novel, which means that it's told through letters, which is a certain distancing from us and the actual story itself. And this is going to be important in terms of our understanding the text. And it's not necessarily an easy thing to film something in the epistolary format. And it certainly would have added length to the Hollywood film. So I suspect those are the two reasons, the two major reasons why Walton and that storyline was completely removed from the film Frankenstein. That said, probably one of the most confusing changes made in the film are the names, Victor and Henry, being swapped. Now, Victor has German and Russian associations, and if you think about the 1930s and some of the political and social conflicts in the time period, you can perhaps understand that Victor might have sounded a little bit too German or a little bit too Russian for an audience, so that the main character, at least in the film, was named Henry. But of course, we know that in the novel, Henry Clerval is the name of the friend, and then Victor is the name of Frankenstein, which is probably also one of the biggest ways that film has helped to distort our understanding of this novel, and that most people think Frankenstein is the name of the creature. And notice that I'm not calling the creature the monster, because one of Mary Shelley's points in the novel is to examine what monstrosity is. And it isn't the creature, it's basically Victor Frankenstein and humanity as a whole that basically would create and abandon and would, in one way or another, not embrace difference or that which is considered to be other. That said, I know that the Hollywood film with the square-jawed, bolt-headed, green-faced Frankenstein has given us an iconic image of what could be considered to be monstrosity. But every time I watch that 1931 film, I'm still struck by its level of subtlety, even though it was in the very early days of cinema. Now, we're introduced in the film to this unnamed creature as monster, and then very later on, we find out that it's Boris Karloff who happens to be playing the role, and it became a very iconic role for him. And it was very profitable for his particular career. That said, I think Boris Karloff tried as much as he could to give us an empathetic portrayal of this creature. Certainly, we have episodes where Fritz, which is nowhere found in the novel, by the way, the stereotypical hunchback, the Igor, if you will, where Fritz is basically tormenting this creature with fire, so we feel a certain level of empathy for it. And then there's that famous film scene where the creature is playing with the child and doesn't understand that when they are throwing paper boats into the water, there's a difference between throwing paper in the water and actually throwing the child herself. So it's more about an innocent not understanding the consequences of life and death and how fragile human beings are. It wasn't done maliciously. That said, when you read the novel, it's a completely different scenario. And it's not Frankenstein playing with a young girl, or it's not the creature, I should say, playing with a young girl. It's a young girl who happens to be drowning. And this is after the creature has been rejected multiple times. But yet he still has enough goodness within himself to try to save this drowning girl. And the reward is that he's attacked and he's shot at, which again shows the brutality and the monstrosity of man. Shelley gives us a creature that really is one that's quite empathetic, and one that is quite childlike in many respects. That said, there is also an enormous amount of intellect associated with this creature, and I suppose we have to suspend some disbelief that a creature could be this intelligent that it could actually teach itself language and teach itself how to read. And not just read, but it reads some of the most complex works of literature that it just so happenstancely happens that it finds in a forest. And I always joke about this, that if you were to wander in the wilderness, you'd happen just to find a satchel that was filled with some of the great works of English literature, such as Paradise Lost or Dante's Inferno. But again, we have to, I guess, suspend some disbelief, and also considering the fact that Mary Shelley was still a teenager when she wrote this particular text. I doubt any of us could have reached the standard that she reached. So I'm willing to perhaps look the other way for some of these places that might stretch believability a little bit too much. Of course, Hollywood doesn't give us an intelligent, thoughtful creature. Hollywood gives us this grunting monstrosity, which really takes away the idea of the level of sophistication of this creature. And it's even undercut in the film with the idea that a diseased brain is used, an abnormal brain. Or if you've ever seen Young Frankenstein, and I highly encourage it if you haven't seen it, it's abnormal. And you'll understand that joke once you watch Young Frankenstein. That's supposed to be the explanation for the creature's evil, so to speak, even though the reality is that we don't really see a whole lot of evil from this particular creature. Certainly not in the way that we see in the novel and how humanity treats this particular creature. The main question of what is monstrosity is addressed probably in the novel title, which again, I think because of Hollywood, people have tended to simplify and shorten. The title is not Frankenstein. The title in its entirety is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And that's going to be important in terms of setting the stage for the actual novel itself. Prometheus comes from Greek mythology. Basically, Prometheus was punished for stealing fire from the gods to give it to humanity. And we will see parallels in the novel itself with Victor Frankenstein, who also is punished for stealing forbidden knowledge, in effect, and the idea of how to create life from death and how to create everlasting life, and the consequences of that. And the literary references in this text, well, certainly you can understand the text without the literary references. It is very helpful to understand, for instance, Milton's Paradise Lost, especially in the title page when we are given a quotation from Milton's Paradise Lost. And the title page reads, give me a moment here. The title page reads with a quotation from Paradise Lost. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Now, Paradise Lost happens to be an epic poem that was written by John Milton, a very famous epic poem. John Milton is oftentimes put in the same category as Shakespeare, so one of the greats of English literature. And this poem happens to be about the fall of man, and it also happens to be about the expulsion of Lucifer from heaven, one of God's brightest angels, and the consequences of being outcast into hell, and how ultimately Lucifer, Satan, tried to corrupt man's greatest, or God's greatest creation, which happened to be man in the Garden of Eden. So this sense of being created and then being ignored is something that Lucifer, or Satan, laments in the epic poem Paradise Lost, which in some ways is a rather subversive poem, because while we're supposed to be thinking of God and Jesus as the heroes of the poem, we bond very quickly with the Lucifer or Satan character, who presents himself as basically a lost creation, created by God as the brightest angel, and then basically ignored after the new creation, mankind, was made. And this sense of Lucifer having a certain level of empathy or sympathy associated with him is something that Mary Shelley is also going to be playing with when she presents our creature. And the creature itself basically compares himself to not only Adam, who was created without a mate, so that God had to create a female. And this is going to be important in the novel when the creature later asks Victor to create it a mate so that it's not alone. But also the creature compares itself to a kind of Satan or Lucifer figure that basically is outcast and rejected. There also are references to other literary texts. For instance, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which happens to be what I did my own graduate work with. Christopher Marlowe being a contemporary of William Shakespeare, also a dramatist during the same time period in England, probably best known for his play Dr. Faustus, which happens to be the story of a greatly accomplished man that has accomplished all that can be accomplished in law and medicine and divinity, and wants to learn more. He wants to know the forbidden knowledge of the gods. So he makes a deal with the devil in order to be able to obtain that forbidden knowledge, and the payment is that eventually, upon his death, the devil will collect Dr. Faustus's soul. This is very much a kind of morality play. If you haven't already guessed, you're not supposed to make deals with the devil. It turns out that Dr. Faustus, although he says he has noble intentions at the beginning of the play, wanting to make men live eternally, he basically squanders his knowledge playing practical jokes on people, because he can make himself invisible, for instance. And so he spends a good amount of time tormenting church officials by making himself invisible and moving chalices around and so forth. And throughout the play, he spends a good amount of time talking about that he's so evil and corrupt that he could never be forgiven by God. Therefore, he may as well enjoy his time on earth, because eventually he will have to relinquish his soul to Satan. Or that God shows mercy to everyone, and would even show mercy to Dr. Faustus if he repented, and he had enough time to still enjoy himself on earth and repent and be able to go to heaven. So he vacillates back and forth. By the ending of the play, as basically Dr. Faustus is being pulled into hell itself, this is where he tries to repent, too little too late, and the consequences that he's going to spend eternity in hell. And the moral or lesson, or one of the morals or lessons for us as audience, is that you shouldn't aspire to the knowledge of gods, that's great arrogance and hubris, and there are consequences associated with that. So I had mentioned this idea of Walton and the epistolary novel. And it's very easy to forget that the novel is introduced through Walton, who is a ship captain who's writing letters to his sister, Margaret. And he talks a little bit about how lonely and isolated he is. And he also talks about the great ambitions he has to try to find knowledge, in this instance, a geographic discovery that no one has before him. He has a good number of parallels to Victor. It's one of the reasons why Mary Shelley introduces us to this character of Walton in the text. In terms of the plot device, it turns out that Walton is on a ship with his crew, and they happen to see Walton shipwrecked on the seas, and they take him in, and Victor is very sick at that particular point. And Victor tells Walton that he wants to caution Walton against the dangers of ambition and hubris, excessive arrogance and pride. and that he has a story to tell him about the dangers of trying to aspire to the knowledge of gods. And then that's where we shift from the actual letters to going into chapters, where we are related these chapters, or we're supposed to be related these chapters, as Victor's story, where Walton is at the ending of the day writing out everything that Victor says to him. There are a good number of problems with this. Certainly, the accuracy of the text is under question when you've got a Walton who is in rather poor physical and emotional condition. He's lonely, he's afraid his crew is going to mutiny, he feels isolated, he is physically deprived, and the fact that so much time elapsed from when Victor tells the tale to Walton, and then Walton actually, at the ending of the day, if he has time, is able to write this out. And the way that Walton writes it out is literally the way that it's told to him, using the I that Victor would use. So it's very easy when we are reading the novel to forget that it isn't Victor who's speaking. It's always Walton who's speaking. Walton is telling us this entire tale. All of these other characters are characters that we never meet. This is Walton's translation, which leads to questions about the accuracy of the text. How much can we rely on this text if it's quite possible that Walton has made errors, or it's quite possible that Walton is fabricating? And considering the fact that Victor and Walton share so many similarities, you can read this text from a psychological perspective, that Victor is a kind of personification of Walton's inner fears and inner desires. That said, the text usually is read as it actually occurring, because it probably is more interesting to read it this way than to dismiss the entire story as a fabrication from Walton. But as we are introduced to Victor, we know that he also is in a very poor state, both emotionally and physically, by the time he is rescued by Walton. So even if, and it's a big if, we could rely on Walton completely and the accuracy of his telling us the tale, we can't necessarily rely on the accuracy of Victor telling the tale. Because really, what we get is the tale from Victor, and that includes the creature's tale. The creature's tale is told to us by Victor. And actually, it isn't told to us by Victor. It's told to Walton by Victor, and then Walton tells it to us. So you can see the levels of distance and the levels of ambiguity in this particular text. So if you wanted to, you could talk about Victor perhaps not existing or being a figment of Walton's imagination. Or perhaps Victor does exist, but the creature, who also shares a good number of parallels with Victor, they're almost like a father and son, which we will be talking about, that it's almost a love-hate relationship with one another, that they need each other to exist, and when they don't have the opportunity to interact with one another, even to interact with hatred with one another, there really is no reason for existence to continue. But if we wanted to read this particular text literally, again, then what we've got is a Walton who has a good number of parallels to a Victor Frankenstein. And Victor Frankenstein is giving us a morality tale trying to warn Walton. And through that, you can think of Mary Shelley trying to warn us as audience about what not to do. Now, all of this said, this is a women in literature class, and what we've got are central male characters. Yes, we are introduced to some female characters, but they seem to be secondary to the male characters. For instance, Walton is writing to his sister, and notice that she's referred to in letter 1 as Mrs. Seville, again saying everything about how female identity is based on the male surname and not on the fact of whether she's married or she happens to be single. However, I would view this as a cautionary tale as to what happens when female is excluded from society and from the life of male. Walton oftentimes talks about how he's lonely and isolated. And I suspect that one of the messages embedded in the text is if Walton had not abandoned society, and specifically had not abandoned female influence in his life, such as sister, he never would have gotten into this kind of position in the first place. And I would say it's the same thing with Victor. Notice how Victor has the opportunity to be with family and friends, specifically to be with his beloved Elizabeth, and instead he rejects that and tries to create life without the assistance of female. He tries to create life just as male, and we see that the consequences of that are absolutely horrific. Again, I would say a cautionary tale about what happens when you try to exclude female from life. There are also some female characters in the novel that are rather interesting in terms of their being perhaps a little bit bolder than we might expect during the time period, while Elizabeth seems rather passive as she continues to wait for Victor. And Elizabeth is an interesting character because she's adopted into the family, and she's viewed as a kind of cousin, but she and Victor are raised as brother and sister, and yet there is this sense that they are going to be unified through marriage. That's the intention of the family. Though it wouldn't have been that unusual during the time period to have arranged marriages and even to have marriages of cousins. So that said, it would be less surprising then than it would be now. Elizabeth is particularly interesting because when we find out how she was adopted into the family, the importance of her appearance, that she's very fair with blonde hair and blue eyes. She's considered to be the epitome of beauty and the epitome of European, as opposed to those ignoble savages that she's surrounded by, those dark-haired individuals who are not European. So we get embedded, as progressive as Mary Shelley's text might be, in relation to the creature and about how we shouldn't reject that which appears different from ourselves, that which is viewed as other. And think about how often sexism and racism and classism, as we talk about the isms, are related on this idea of externals and rejecting that which is different. We can still see how Mary Shelley is influenced by the prejudices of her day. There definitely is a prejudice towards Europeanism. It's a very Eurocentric text. There definitely is a preference and a prejudice towards Christianity in this text, which we will see when we are introduced to the character of Safie. And Safie I find fascinating. If you haven't gotten to that point yet, it's something that was not included in the film version. This would be the subplot of how the creature teaches itself language and tries to reach out to humanity and is again rejected. This is through the De Lacy family. And it's a long, convoluted tale, but basically, Safie takes action to try to be with the man that she loves, and she basically defies her father and goes out on her own in order to try to find Felix, which she's able to do, even though she doesn't know the customs of the land, because she's an Arab, and she also doesn't know the language. Which shows a rather strong female for a time period when you think about the cult of true womanhood and many of the other texts that we discuss about female, where that would have seemed rather eyebrow raising. Perhaps even today it would seem rather eyebrow raising. So even though we've got central male characters, including the creature itself, again, I think that one of the ways to view this as a text for women in literature and a feminist text is that we see the descent of society when female is excluded. And we also see some strong females like Safie. And there are long passages about the environment and the beauty of nature in the natural world. And I was talking a little bit about this in terms of Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's husband, the great romantic poet, who had reviewed her manuscript and suggested that she expand and develop her tale. And some of that, I suspect, was based on expanding and developing these long passages where you're describing the sublime in nature. This was very common literary technique for the Romantics, where they embraced and celebrated nature and the natural world and its connection to humanity. But nature is oftentimes viewed as female. We refer to nature as Mother Nature. So if we were going to think of nature as a female character, perhaps that is our major female character. And perhaps that character is just as important as Victor and the creature. And those passages are more than just filler or more than just convention, but they also make a statement about the importance of the feminine. And when we are first introduced to the creature, we're told how the creature is able to embrace nature, even though the creature is still new to the world and doesn't understand language and doesn't understand society, which is supposed to be a way that we think of the benevolence and the goodness of this creature. And also, it's something that we see with Victor as well, that once he is surrounding himself with the natural world, his physical and emotional state improves dramatically. The difficulties occur when he isolates himself from the natural world. And in fact, he embeds himself in his work. And some critics have even read this text as a kind of critique of the matriarchal, or a critique on the patriarchal work ethic, at what happens when you work to the exclusion of the natural world, to the exclusion of friendship and family, to the exclusion of female. And only negative things can happen in that particular respect. There also are a good number of occult references in this text. I had indicated that this is one of the texts that I study in my Gothic literature class and that I assign. And it's also a text that oftentimes is assigned in science fiction, because there are many modern day scientific parallels that could be connected with Frankenstein. And not just the idea of what is the moral or the ethical responsibility of scientists, or one of my favorite quotes in Jurassic Park, of all things, just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. And I think we see this very much embedded in Victor's pursuit of knowledge. But also we see elements like cloning. How can you create life without, let's say, the sexual union of male and female, or even artificial insemination? And is that unnatural in one way or another? And are there consequences to be paid for that? Not that Mary Shelley understood the science of the time in the way that we understand the science of our time. She could never understand the science of our times. But certainly the science of her time and her imagination allowed her to perhaps anticipate some of the scientific possibilities. And that usually is the distinction that is called between science fiction and Gothic. And that science fiction is something that's possible through science, while something like Gothic or horror supernatural literature is something that is not possible through the laws of nature or the laws of science. Hence, it is supernatural, above and beyond the natural world. And we can read Frankenstein in both ways. Certainly there is the idea of Victor Frankenstein as scientist and being able to discover the way to reanimate life from death. Probably he's motivated in part, not just because of ambition and hubris, but because of the loss of his own mother. And this is a theme that we will see over the semester, not one that I had planned in any way, but when we read the text over and over again, we've got, and we will see that we have characters that don't have central mother figures in their lives. And that might be important in terms of the idea of our understanding gender this particular semester. But when Victor loses his mother to scarlet fever, well, then he's very eager to be able to find the secrets of life and death and to be able to conquer death. And this is where he comes up with this idea of creating his creature. And one could say that through scientific means, he's able to do such a thing. And hence, this is a novel of science or science fiction. But this is also a supernatural novel, that which defies the laws of nature, because it makes references to the occult, which, by the way, means unknown or unknowable. And there are references to things like Cornelius Agrippa, who happens to be a very famous magician and occultist, and also the Philosopher's Stone, which is supposed to give eternal life. And if you're a Harry Potter fan, then you are probably familiar with the Sorcerer's Stone, also known as the Philosopher's Stone. So we know that Victor isn't just dabbling in science, he's also dabbling in the occult, which is why this text oftentimes is viewed as one of the great Gothic texts. And certainly the 1931 film presenting Frankenstein and Dracula and the Universal movie monsters of the 1930s as the supernatural entities. That too has sort of cemented Frankenstein's place in horror and Gothic. And if you're curious as to what Gothic is, Gothic you might know as a architectural term, and it was oftentimes used to discuss excess in relation to architecture. You can think about these huge grandiose cathedrals, something like St. Patrick's Cathedral, which at the time were considered somewhat grotesque. Now they're considered rather beautiful. Gothic is also a term of the Goths, who were barbarians who basically were conquered. And if you take both of these terms, this idea of Gothic was created in the 1700s in England with a Gothic text known as the Castle of Otranto, where there were these supernatural or seemingly supernatural or unexplained elements. Atmosphere was also particularly important. If, again, you think about the architecture of the great Gothic cathedrals, so that you would have these large haunted castles with these long, echoey hallways with lots of dark and secret passages and unexplained events. If you think about how Gothic has sort of transformed itself into horror film, you know that many of the tropes of horror film, or even the tropes associated with Halloween, when we think about the atmosphere, it's supposed to be dark and eerie and so forth. All of that is embedded within the idea of Gothic. And within the Gothic, one of the things we find is not only some sort of a moral lesson, but we also find that isolation is a negative thing, that most of these texts embrace the sense of needing community and needing others. And notice this with Victor when he isolates himself. Notice this with Walton as he has isolated himself. And notice this with the creature who's been isolated against his will. So you'll see that in the notes below, I've indicated some of these points that I wanted you to consider. And in the letters that I was referencing, the letters to Mrs. Seville, Walton's sister's Margaret, Walton says in letter 1, and this is a quote, and I put this quote in the notes: "I prefer glory to every enticement that wealth placed in my path." Now, this is something else to consider with not just this text, but with many of the texts we're going to be reading this semester, that we're reading stories of privilege, individuals who have a good amount of wealth and a good amount of status in society. That will definitely change by the time we start to get to Jane Eyre, and then certainly by the time we get to Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. But definitely we see that embedded within Frankenstein, and we'll even see that more so in Persuasion. So if you've already started reading Persuasion, you can see that it is a rather long-winded text. It's very leisurely because it's supposed to show what the life of the privileged classes was like during the time period, the nobility and the landed gentry, and basically they didn't work, and more often than not they had nothing to do except to gossip and also to throw huge dinner parties and to try to show off to their neighbors. And we see that in the story of Persuasion. These characters are not supposed to come off as positives. We're supposed to see them as negatives. And the narrator, Anne, even though she was born into this society, she's very different, or at least somewhat different from the others. And that's the person that we're basically supposed to be connected with, Anne, in Persuasion, if you're wondering, you're reading Persuasion, as the novel tries to persuade us that there's more to life than dinner parties and being landed gentry. So that's a little bit of a clue of what to consider in the future. And then Persuasion, through the character of Anne Elliot, gives us a very central female character, one that we don't necessarily see as easily in Frankenstein. But when Walton says, "I have no friend, Margaret, unvisited regions I'm about to explore," think about how similar that is to Victor as well, where he visits unvisited regions, though Walton in letter 2 is saying that literally, that he's visiting geographic regions. But of course, we find out that Victor is doing the same when he's trying to learn the knowledge of gods. He's trying to create life from death. And in letter 3, Walton says, "What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man?" And of course, we learn both through Victor and also through Walton that there are consequences. One can't just act based on their ambitions and based on their goals. And Walton talks in letter 4. Now, and Walton talks about in letter 4 how he meets Victor, and Victor tells Walton, and this is a quote, "I saw for the dominion I should acquire and transmit over the elemental foes of our race. Unhappy man, do you share my madness?" So this is Victor's cautionary tale to Walton not to commit the same mistakes that I've committed. And in letter 4, Walton also says about Victor that there is a slave to passion. And there is a cautionary tale in here about not letting passion enslave an individual. This is where we get Victor's story. But the story also is complicated because even though Victor says that he doesn't necessarily want Walton to follow his mistakes, we see throughout Victor's tale that there are multiple mistakes, and if you make it to the ending of the novel, Victor seems to vacillate. At one point, he's encouraging Walton's men to continue on this dangerous journey rather than to admit defeat. So Victor never completely accepts responsibility, and that's probably the biggest monstrous act that Victor commits. It's monstrous enough to create life from death. It's unnatural, especially when female is excluded. And it certainly is something that is monstrous when we think about Victor's response once he's actually created the creature. He completely abandons it, and he doesn't take any responsibility for its creation, even though he's a father figure. And again, one of the first responsibilities of a parent is to name a child or to name a creation. That's oftentimes what happens when one adopts a pet, for instance. And Victor never does that. This creature is unnamed. And again, we see this very clearly in the novel, less so in the film, where the name Frankenstein has become associated with the creature, but the creature is never given a name in either the film or in the novel. Frankenstein is the name of the creator, even though the film changed around the first names, as I was indicating. Frankenstein is not the name of the creature, who is basically a kind of tabula rasa, if you've ever heard this term before in psychology or in philosophy, a kind of blank slate. And one of the questions that we'll have with the creature is about life itself. Is life influenced by nature or nurture? By genetics or by environment? And what we see is a combination of the two. But this creature seems to be more benevolent and good than bad. And there's reference to this over and over again throughout the text. And that we don't see with Victor, even though Victor proclaims himself to have a greater good. We don't necessarily see that. He claims that his aspirations are for the benefit of mankind, but we see that it's more for his own benefit. And again, he negates his responsibility, which is probably much, much worse than the actual creation in the first place. And think about how this can be in many ways read as a tale about parenthood in general, about the idea of creating a child, thinking about the needs of the parents, not necessarily thinking about the needs of the child. The child never asked to be created. And then what happens when the parents don't take responsibility for the rearing of that particular child? And how much is to blame, or how much can we blame the child for that child acting out afterwards? Certainly, the parents have to take a certain level of responsibility for negating caretaking of the child. That said, eventually the child turns into an adult and the child has to accept some responsibility for its own actions. And it's these thorny questions that are embedded within Victor and his creation of his creature. A creature who is going to ask for, at one point or another, a mate. He's going to ask for a female. And that I think also is important for English 247 and this idea of gender. And this is where I'm going to leave us today. And then next class, I'll start talking about the actual chapters and Victor's story, and then transition over into paper topics, and also transition over into the beginnings of persuasion. But we're supposed to have empathy for the creature because the creature obviously doesn't want to be alone. So it's a very reasonable request to ask for a mate. But again, he asked for a female, and never once is that female consulted in terms of her creation, which leads to the thorny question: is the creature doing the same thing that Victor did in terms of creation for its own self-benefit, without thinking about the consequences and the responsibilities to the creation? So I'll leave you with that question. But for today's attendance question, what I thought I would ask you about is Mary Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique, the use of letters to tell us this story, which again is a distancing element. It leads to questions of the reliability of the narrator and the accuracy of the text. In some ironic ways, it could also lead to a certain level of a historical accuracy if there is a written record. And if you've been reading Frankenstein, you'll see that there are lots of episodes where information is gathered through letters found in pockets, for instance. It was a technique that Shakespeare actually used himself in many of his plays. But I was curious to know about this use of the epistolary novel technique, which again we don't see in the film, but leads to an incredible layer of complexity with the novel itself. Did you like or dislike Shelley's use of the epistolary novel technique, and why? And again, as you know, there is no necessarily right or wrong answer to that. I'm more curious in your thoughts and reflections. And while you aren't required to respond to the thoughts and reflections of your peers, I ask you to read the thoughts and reflections of your peers and my responses to them, because that'll give you a sense of some of what we would have discussed in class if we were meeting in person. So what I'm going to do next class is to talk about the chapters and the ending of the novel. I'm also going to talk about the first paper and begin us with persuasion. So I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're staying cool. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Frankenstein, putting some closure onto that, and then moving forward. Take care. Bye-bye.